We have Frank Gaffney, the president of the Center for Security Policy, joining us now. Frank, good morning.
Well, good morning, Raheem.
Frank, you have a regular segment on this show, so it's purely by coincidence that we have you on today, but it is the day after another radical Islamic terror attack was waged on, as you said, in your Secure Freedom Minute, an attack not on New Yorkers, not on Americans, not on Westerners, but an attack on us. You said more of us were murdered yesterday. I think that's an incredible way of phrasing it. Something we often forget. These things can be quite remote to our minds, even when they happen in London, and they happen in Paris, and they happen in New York City. Frank, just talk us through, for a start. That was some pretty specific wording that you had there in your Secure Freedom Minute. Just talk us through that for a second, because I found it particularly well phrased.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a fairly commonplace way of addressing it. It's another assault on Western civilization, and all of us who have lived under it, who have prospered from it, who have come, as we often do in this country, taken it for granted. And the point really was to tee up the second line, Raheem, which is that all other things being equal, this is going to happen to more of us. Take it to the bank. So the underlying point, which you understand better than just about anybody, is if we persist in doing what we've been doing, and the way I would briefly summarize that is submitting, we're going to find our enemies, and that's who they are. These are not all Muslims, to be clear, but the Muslims who embrace the totalitarian political, military, legal doctrine they call Sharia, are going to kill more of us. And therefore, I think it is high time, and I know Breitbart does an outsized job of doing this, and I'm very grateful to you for being able to contribute to it, week upon week, but to have an honest, thoughtful, and free speech informed conversation, debate about submission and whether we can safely continue to engage in it in a lot of different ways, Raheem. And again, that's partly what we have to discuss, not just the phenomenon, but how we're doing it and why this enemy perceives this as a red cape to a bull to come charging at us even more viciously in the future.
Frank, you're among friends with this audience, people who fully subscribe to that. If submission is the way of the political establishment and the liberal left, then this audience truly is the real hashtag resistance out there. A word, a phrase, a slogan used by people in opposition to this president usually, but I would say perhaps better used for those unwilling to bow before, as you say, Sharia supremacism. Frank, a lot of people on this on the lines now listening, they've had the honest conversation about this. They don't want to talk anymore. They want action. What does it mean to you now that this guy came in on this diversity visa, which was a program established in the 1990s? We know that President Trump has been opposed to this. Do you think this will hasten its demise?
Well, I pray so, Raheem. But just two quick points. One is that the term submission, of course, as you know, is the literal meaning of the word Islam. Excuse me. And therefore, I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. I'm saying that's what people, and many of them, yes, have come here under the diversity lottery. It's not so much a lottery, it's Russian roulette, for God's sake. We don't have a clue who these people are, but just because they come from parts of the world that are unrepresented or underrepresented, boom, their lucky day is perhaps the loaded chamber in that revolver. It's really bad for the rest of us. So does this mean if we have, and I'm not talking about this audience needing to have this conversation. You're so right. I mean, you particularly, and again, let me just commend you for your latest contribution to this. Not latest, you were up all night doing it, but your new book, no-go zones, for crying out loud. There is a perfect example, as you know so well, of submission of the worst kind happening in Europe and happening here. But, Raheem, to your question, what we have to be doing is revisiting all of the premises with the rest of the American people about what's going on here, whether it is about immigration, and simply having an honest chat about whether importing more jihadists is a responsible thing to be doing. And if it's not, then you have to get behind the sorts of things that President Trump's recommended. Those principles. Just yesterday, people were giving very short shrift, including John McCain and others who said he hadn't even read the principles that the president laid out as what he thought needed to be done in order to do a deal on DACA, one of which was end this visa lottery. Well, it's time again that we compel people like John McCain and Democrats and others to read what the president is saying and, more to the point, act on it, and also vetting, of course. And also, I would argue, we have to be rigorous about the fact that if they're multi-use facilities, they're not simply houses of worship. They're cultural centers, as they call them. They're, madrasas or schools in many cases. They're places where community centers convene. They're also places oftentimes where training and certainly recruitment for jihadism takes place. These are known as mosques to most of us. These are places that need to be surveilled, and where that kind of activity has taken place, Raheem, they need to be shut down.
Okay, so let's talk about that because that was a major recommendation of my book, and in fact, I've gone a little bit further in the past few months as my continent and my country has experienced some of these attacks. I've said not just shut down, but I've said bulldozed. There needs to be a sure sign, and if by the way, if the Saudis, as they've said in the last couple of weeks, if they really want to back off from what they've been doing, which is seeding this stuff in the Western world, and if they want to, preach a more moderate version of Islam, then they can provide the bulldozers to prove it. There has to be a sure sign out there from our side, and indeed from the other side too, that, as you say, these multi use places, which are usually not places of just prayer. In fact, the places of just prayer are the ones that aren't concerning to me. The ones that are used as schools, the ones that are used as quote-unquote community centers as well, and they get their planning application, by the way, Frank, you know this, from starting as community centers and then building outwards from there. Well, if they are preaching a particularly virulent, violent, literalist, fundamentalist, whatever you want to call it, interpretation...
Sharia.
Yeah, quite right. Then they have to be bulldozed. And the reason, and you see Bill de Blasio and all these guys come out and withdraw the NYPD's ability to monitor and track these places and figure out what's going on in these places, like they did in where this guy spent some time, right, out there in New Jersey. Then how do we identify which ones must be shut down?
Well, this is a great question. There's so much to say about this, Raheem. If I could just make a couple of quick points. One is the reason you're talking about bulldozing, and that will probably sound very extreme to a lot of people, but it's because you understand the symbolic aspects of this. The mosques are being built with the minarets higher than any church, for example. They're in some cases being built on top of churches, or churches are being turned into mosques. And this was why it was so infuriating when the Sharia adherent, the Sharia supremacists in New York City were insisting within, I think, yards of where this attack took place yesterday that some of that hallowed ground of the World Trade Center area be turned into a mosque, a very tall mosque at that. It's about symbolism. So undoing that symbolism, showing that they're not winning, showing that if they embrace this Sharia program, they must be put out of business, would be an incredibly symbolic and important gesture. A colleague of mine by the name of David Yerushalmi was the leading force behind a very important survey a couple of years back now of 100 mosques chosen at random across the country. And to your question about how do we know, he arranged for undercover folks to go into these mosques to look for empirical evidence of things that are the typical trappings of Sharia supremacism. Typically, the men are separated from the women. They, pray in very, very precise lines. They wear certain jewelry. They wear certain clothes. They have henna in their beard, and all and all. Things that could be observed. And what he was looking for was evidence not only of Sharia adherence in these 100 mosques, but also whether they, in fact, also promoted jihadism. Something, again, you could discern by talking to the imams, talking to the lay leaders, looking at what's promoted in the books and in the videos and so on in the libraries and in the bookstores. And what he established, and this was a peer-reviewed study, by the way, statistically very rigorously done. It appeared in two important publications. I believe Middle East Quarterly was one, and the other, I think, the Journal of Counterterrorism, something like that. And what he found in this random survey, Raheem, which, again, speaks to your question, was that out of those 100 mosques, 80 of them were Sharia adherent, observably, and in every single one of those 80, his undercover investigators found evidence that they were promoting jihadism. So is that representative of all of these mosques across America, some 3,000 of them? Hard to say, but it's a starting point for figuring it out and what we need to do about it.
Just extraordinary stuff. Frank, I'm afraid we run a little bit over, so I'm going to have to leave it there. I can talk to you about this not just all day long, but for years and years on end. And unfortunately, I'm sure, as you said, this won't be the last attack, so I'm sure we will have more and more opportunities to go over this. But let's just hope, and for those out there that are inclined, pray that this administration manages to get a grip on it. Frank Gaffney, once again, thank you so much for joining us here on Breitbart News Daily.